It doesn't take much to make radiation scary, and this episode hits the nail on the head where that's concerned. Let's get to it, shall we?
You should see me in a tank top.
Pour you coffee?
The Outer Limits.
A pair of scientists at a nuclear research lab are tinkering with a chunk of nobelium isotope in a so-called furnace reactor, when another group of scientists come in to dispose of an unstable material with an atomic weight north of 256. For reference, that puts it up in the top 20 known elements, in that place where materials have short half-lives and are only created in particle accelerators. Before I go any further, I just want to point out that the scientific jargon of this episode is more accurate to the science of the time than it has any right to be. Despite thick shielding between the two materials, they start to react to one another, producing a massive spike in radiation. All but one of the scientists leave to get help and secure more shields, but the man left behind, Collins, succumbs to the radiation. Then, his physical body is replaced by exotic energy capable of filling the suit and mimicking basic human behavior. The other men return to the outer room with a new lead shield, just as their boss, Dr. Marshall, arrives and tells them not to go into the furnace chamber. Koenig insists on going in to save Collins, however, and he quickly discovers what has happened to his coworker before he too falls victim to the strange energy. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last time Spock was hit with a lethal dose of radiation.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
Sensing the immediate danger, Marshall tells the men to get as much lead shielding as they possibly can and puts the facility in a state of emergency to deal with the rising radiation levels coming from the furnace. Marshall then explains to his colleague, the absurdly named Paul Pollard, that bizarre stellar objects have been discovered by astronomers that could be natural sources of transuranium elements, and hints that the newly formed material causing so much havoc is related to them in some way. He goes on to say that these stellar objects and this strange matter are literally tearing a hole in the fabric of reality. Before he can explain himself further, though, the two men's wives show up with sandwiches. They're apprised of the situation and seem to understand it all pretty well. Even better than me, if I'm honest. But they insist on staying until the emergency rises to the level where their husbands leave with them. Meanwhile, one of the energy beings walks out of the furnace chamber, when one of the men, Coulter, is badly irradiated and blinded just from looking at it. Once told about this, Pollard goes to see Coulter, but Marshall stays behind with the women, suddenly claiming to be unsteady.
Are you all right? Not too steady.
Coulter explains to Pollard his encounter with the energy being, which he describes as a blue light, which, by the way, is what criticality looks like, before he is taken away by medics and apparently dies off-screen. Pollard wants to take more shielding into the outer room and find whatever remains of Collins, but his wife doesn't want him to risk his life. He and his team go in anyway, find Collins' suit empty, and are subsequently attacked by the thing in Koenig's suit. Only one man, Griffin, makes it out, while the rest of them, including Pollard, are taken to the furnace and transformed into more energy beings. Pollard's wife runs out to save her husband in a fit of panic, but Dr. Marshall refuses to go after her. His wife, Laurel, chides him for his cowardice, and then Dr. Marshall delivers one of the silliest sci-fi monologues I've ever heard.
Gravity will collapse. Radiation. Contagion. It'll burn us.
The upshot is that Dr. Marshall admits to using, quote, quasi-stellar sources, unquote, in the creation of the exotic material, and now believes all of time and space are in danger. Griffin tries to save Mrs. Pollard, but in the process, he too gets assimilated. Then Laurel, like an absolute badass, runs in and gets Mrs. Pollard out, eventually joined by her husband after he has a brief bout of complete insanity in his office. They then learn that the energy beings can't survive if they go too far from their source. Marshall finds his courage, and after they get Mrs. Pollard out, he and his wife stay behind to solve the crisis while the civil authority evacuates the area. I'm just gonna fast forward through the next 20 minutes of the episode because nothing much happens at this point. The energy beings move around in a daisy chain formation, Marshall struggles with some math, and Laurel strokes his ego until finally, Marshall comes up with a way to stop the fission process by creating a fusion one. This is, of course, an easy, trivial thing for him to do.
Super easy, barely an inconvenience. Oh, really?
And the energy beings help him, I think? It's not very clear. Then Marshall and his wife put some distance between themselves and the subsequent nuclear explosion, which for some reason reverses time and doubles back on itself, ending the crisis. The first half of this episode is absolutely amazing, but the second half doesn't seem to know what to do with such a wonderful setup. Yes, the hour-long runtime is at least partially to blame, but I will say the extended tension and suspense of the climax work a little bit better than in similar episodes of the show. However, the length isn't the main reason this episode falls off a cliff halfway through. I love the idea behind the story, and like I said, the underlying science is impressively detailed, even if the idea of energy beings from another dimension leaking through an atomic reaction with exotic materials from outer space is pretty pulpy. It manages to take a lot of relatively dry concepts and make a coherent, frightening narrative out of them, and that's no small task. Unfortunately, the story hinges on the character of Marshall, who, other than having a crisis of courage, doesn't carry the story well enough to justify his status as protagonist. He's also not helped by the extremely hammy acting of Georgia McCready, an actor I've loved in other things like Paths of Glory. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a bad episode. Far from it, actually. So let me just say that, on the strength of the first half alone, I put this episode pretty high on my list of favorites. And that's all I have on production and decay of strange particles. Now, as always, do all those YouTubey things. Check out my Patreon! And all that other good YouTubey stuff. But until next time, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
I don't want to die.
Nobody wants to die.